York? Ooh, major faux pas, especially tonight. Maybe I should just go back upstairs. Anyways, will the conversation last about an hour, and then doors will be open for the main event upstairs, James Tenney Resistance. So please take it away, Bruce.
Thank you. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the panel discussion. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge this meeting space is situated upon the traditional territory of First Nations, most recently the Mississaugas of New Credit, and it is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We recognize their enduring presence and are grateful to be on this sacred land. And in addition, I would like to also express thoughts and prayers, sometimes cliche thought, with sorrow for the people of Mogadishu and the Somali community here in Toronto for the devastating attack we've heard of just today. My name is Bruce Russell, as you just heard, and my sort of orbit with the music gallery goes back about 4 decades to my time in Toronto as a volunteer and host of Radio Music Gallery at one point. And I was a student of Jim's at York University in the 80s and 90s. And two of my favorite memories of his are piano memories. When I was in his Charles Ives course, he did one of his famous readings of the Concord Sonata from memory, which is a monstrously difficult piece, whether you're reading it or not. And he also performed a one piano demonstration of his 2-piano work, Chromatic Canon. A very Jim kind of moment. Jaw just on the floor. So we've introduced the panelists, but I wanted to say a little bit more about them so you have some context. On your left, we have Parmela Attariwala, who is a musician and academic who hails from Calgary and who has lived and worked in Toronto since 1994. She plays violin, viola, and fiddle, and teaches at York University and the Regent Park School of Music. She has toured and recorded with Carla Bley, Ravi Naimpally, Anthony Braxton, and many others, as well as releasing several albums of her own work and touring it globally. She performs traditional and contemporary classical with ensembles such as the Spree Orchestra, the Hamilton Philharmonic, and National Ballet Orchestra, as well as being a member of Toronto's creative improv scene. And to next one down, Cheldon Paterson, aka SlowPitchSound, was born in Grenada and lives and works here. He refers to himself as a sci-fi turntablist and is the resident experimental DJ for contemporary music organization Soundstreams. He has released 7 studio albums, and his work has been featured at many major venues, including the AGO and Tiff Bell Lightbox. He is an instructor at the Off-Center DJ and Electronic Music Production School, and is also a mentor at the Regent Park Music School. Lauren Pratt is a producer and coordinator at the California Institute of the Arts. She worked as a publicist in New York for Pauline Oliveros, among others. During her years in Toronto in the 1980s and 90s, she was managing editor of Music Works magazine, president of the Music Gallery Board of Directors, and artist manager for Eva Goyen, Stephen Clark, and others. She was married to James Tenney from 1988 until his death in 2006, and manages his estate and personal archive. Okay, folks, so question 1. What does it mean to be a socially conscious composer now as opposed to 20 to 30 years ago, and what do audiences expect from socially conscious music? Can you give me an example, for now, other than James Tenney, and someone who's going to discuss in a moment, of a composer who, for you, is socially conscious? Anyone can start. It doesn't have to be in the same realm as Tenney.
I'll throw out many years ago, probably getting back to 15, 20 years ago, Bongani Breen used to live in Toronto, and he started the Ensemble Noir. And he introduced us, those of us who played with the ensemble, to a number of African composers who were very conscious of the music that they had written over, not just over the past 20 years, but really 40, 50, 60 years. And that's music that's, now that Bongani no longer lives here, it's music that isn't played in North America anymore. But for them, that's my first example, and that was really what spurred me into thinking about it. My conversations with Pongani, and then when we were touring in Africa and talking to the composers there, and what composing music in a Western sense of composition, what that means to them, what it means to them when it's performed outside of their country's of origin, and when it's performed at home.
Okay. So
It's a kind of an obscure series of examples, perhaps.
well, I think that's the idea of who is obscure could speak to the issues. And so, if I take this correctly, it's socially conscious in the sense that they were giving space to people outside of the Western white male composer paradigm.
That they were giving space, but it was more that they themselves were socially
Yeah.
conscious because they were so unusual in what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly when they were performed here, it was very unusual. But even for them to have been played by a Western ensemble, and for that Western ensemble then to go to Africa and play their music, that was a very unusual moment, I think, for them.
Anyone else?
For me, composition, I think for me it's going to be a bit of a twist or a little bit different, but I think I'm a producer myself, and I compose music a totally different way, you know. So for me, what kind of really people that stuck out was like, I would go back to like even Sun Ra, you know, and at the time it's like what was happening there, and his composition style and stuff really influenced me. And then going later on, I mean, there was like many others, I can't, all kinds of names there, but going on later, even hip hop music for me, and the producers and the people doing stuff at the time were speaking to what's happening socially at that time, and that really, I guess, inspired and influenced me, and just made me look at things a little different, because right now, like the word composition, when you hear composition, you do automatically right away, it's like, I think white, composer, you know, classical music or something like that. Notation and all that stuff, but it goes much further than that. And throughout the years, having just like the awesome privilege and pleasure to like perform with some amazing like people here in Toronto that were doing even like improvisation and stuff like that. Now I'm seeing different types of composition, you know, and bringing it always back to like how I saw producers creating music like hip hop, using those samples and everything from everywhere else, putting it together, but to speak to what's happening, you know, socially, whether it's being like totally poor and just like using whatever's around you to make something. That's like really inspired me. I don't know if that
Oh yeah.
goes with
Yeah. No. I like that answer. What about you?
Well, I started thinking about this, well, I was thinking about it before, but I definitely thought about it a lot on the plane, and then we discussed it over dinner. Again, I have to make a distinction between somebody being socially conscious and somebody acting on that social consciousness. And I thought of three people that, for me, embody social activism through their music. One of them was Cornelius Cardew, who worked very hard to create an equitable musical community just around him. Pauline Oliveros, who gave permission, well, she didn't give permission, she gave people space in which they could feel that they could make music. It didn't matter if they were conservatory educated, it didn't matter if they had an experience, they would be able to make music in a loving, accepting situation, and she created a community around that, and that was very important to her, the creation of that community. And the third example I'm going to give is Raven Chacon, who is a Native American composer from Navajo Nation, and he's working with visual artists to bring issues that are important to his community to a greater consciousness. He participated in a recent Guggenheim exhibition about so-called wall, and but he's also enabling his own community to make music in whatever way they need to, and helping the younger generation be educated in a way that they can. I mean, he's bringing it back to his own community again. I think socially conscious has to start in your own community and build from there, and that's activism to me.
So I'm going to phrase this as, if you believe James Tenney was a socially conscious composer, what for you is evidence of his concerns with social justice in his work? Were there aspects of Tenney's mathematical theoretician approach to composition and his interest in psychoacoustic perception as opposed to the convention of emotional signaling that potentially complemented a socially progressive message? And were there elements of Tenney's methodologies, or those of other composers of the 20th century for that matter, of the avant-garde, that were at odds with their potential to create socially conscious music? So that's sort of a theme there. You don't have to answer those questions as specifically as I phrased them. But we're not talking about Jim here.
Yeah. Do you want me to answer that question?
Please start. Yes.
Okay. I frankly don't think about Jim as certainly not as a terrifically activist composer. I mean, he was activist in the anti-war protests in the 60s, and we marched in LA in the 2000s, and but I don't think of him as a particularly activist composer, except in the sense that I was speaking about it before. He did develop communities. And he once famously said to Steve Reich, the composer is not privy to anything. And by which he was saying the composer, and by extension I would think the professional musician, doesn't really know much more about the sounds that you're hearing than you do yourself. And each person is their own, to me that was very empowering, that each person could be their own expert on what they were hearing. And he didn't feel as though there should be any hierarchical structure of access to music. You didn't need the composer priest to explain it all to you. That I think was pretty radical, especially coming out of a conservatory culture. He went to Juilliard. I mean, it was about as conservatory culture as you can get. And but in terms of actual activism, other than the basic community building, I don't think of him as a particularly politically active or conscious, socially conscious composer.
Okay. I'm passing on that one.
I have to say I don't know Jim's works that well. I heard a number of them when I first moved to Toronto, and then suddenly everyone was playing. I came here in the early 90s, mid-90s, and everyone was playing James Tenney. What is this man? But I wasn't in a state of mind to really notice those social justice issues at the time. I find it intriguing that we're talking about it now, because I think we're in Canada's obviously in a very interesting moment that I actually consider double post-colonial moment.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a post-colonial moment for Indigenous peoples, but we've also been in this maybe 30-year post-colonial, British post-colonial moment as a nation. So since 1988, and I think for us, it's really the last, particularly since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report came out, that we're having to really examine ourselves and our social motivations for doing things or for not doing things, or for examining who's doing what in terms of our artistic production, even what we call art, what we call culture, and whether art / culture has any kind of social implication or larger social justice implication.
Certainly we have a number of pieces on the program tonight that have an unmistakable social message or concern with events that are happening at the time. Lauren, although you stated that you don't see him as an activist composer, can you comment on, say, Fabric for Che or Viet Flakes that we're hearing, and how those might be examples of a socially conscious approach or underlying message?
Well, Fabric for Che is a particularly interesting one because I don't know if Jim ever mentioned this in class or anything, but he wrote that piece as it's a scream.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's a scream of complete frustration in the way the liberations in Central and South America were being viewed by the American press, by the American people because of the American press, and by the American government.
Mm-hmm.
He was invited to give a talk at Brooklyn Polytechnic University shortly after he wrote that piece, and instead of giving a talk on whatever he was supposed to be talking on, I think it was something technical, something about computers and music and the use of computers or something like that, he played that piece and said nothing and then sat down. It was not well received, and you'll understand why because when you hear it, it is not an easy piece to listen to, and especially back then that would have been, I don't know, 64 or something like that, 65, 67. Yeah, it was late 60s. People didn't hear music like that. I mean, right now.
Do they now?
Well, we hear more things that are like that, but back then it was absolutely shocking. And he got a very heartfelt, nasty letter from somebody who was in the audience, another engineer at Brooklyn Polytechnic, who said he went through life in Nazi Germany and came over, I think, right before the war, and now here he is forced to listen to another political diatribe, which he considered Fabric for Che to be, and he felt that he was being forced to listen to it the same way he was forced to listen to Hitler's speeches. So it definitely got a result, but I'm not sure if it was necessarily the result that Jim was hoping for or wanted. Viet Flakes was made at the request of Carolee Schneemann to go along with a large installation and performance in I think it was a 3-day festival of arts against the war. And
and the war had just begun, I believe.
yes, the war, our involvement was just becoming apparent. I think the most radical part of that piece for Jim, for the audience, and for me listening to it now is Jim's use of contrast in music to exemplify the drastic contrast between our happy-go-lucky late 60s lives and the real terror and horror and pain and destruction that we were inflicting on people, hundreds of thousands of miles away. I don't think that really had been done before, and the problem with political work like that is the people who really need to hear it are not hearing it.
Mm-hmm.
They were playing to a very sympathetic crowd there of New York artists who were also disturbed. I mean, they were bringing them news that they didn't have. This production did, but it hardly ever gets out of that very inside crowd
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Well, this is a theme I've seen before. We've seen before. When you speak of the bubble, the choir of people on the left who agree with each other and have a shared culture, whether that's true or not, but that often someone like Jim will be writing pieces that are radical sonically, is not going to fit in with this peace and love, folk guitar kind of aesthetic. And so he's sort of further radicalized because someone feels that he's being fascistic by creating this kind of music. That's my own characterization of it. But
That's what he said, exactly.
okay. I mean, as opposed to going to sit and listen to Wagner, and I don't know if anyone has characterized Wagner as being some kind of torture session because
Well, for Jim, only when they started singing.
because of the pitch perception issues.
Yes.
No offense to
It was
anyone who
that
sings.
vibrato,
It has been. It's 50 years, I think, till last week. 50 years since the day that Che Guevara was executed.
Yeah.
So we're seeing a lot of things in a half century that have only come a little bit further in our understanding and action upon. Do you have any other sort of? We don't have to necessarily always keep to the theme of Jim here. And an example of what a socially conscious piece or composition approach would be, if you want to add something in the middle of that. Okay. Well, and I'd like to go back, if we have time, to Jim's work and a way of looking at it that is not necessarily just about the socially conscious piece, but along the spectrum of radicality, socially conscious down to musically revolutionary, because there's lots to talk about there. But I want to talk about specifically about a piece we're not going to hear on the program tonight. When artistic director David Dax was in the process of programming tonight's concert, one of the proposed works was Tenny's 1992 piece, Ain't I a Woman? For strings and celesta. It's based on the 1851 speech by Sojourner Truth, which is an early example of black anti-slavery resistance and intersectional feminism. The piece uses a technique that Tenney employed in several compositions as early as 3 Indigenous songs of 1979, namely simulating the properties of speech using instruments, with the added component of the instrumentalists making some sounds orally. I should add here that the most widely accepted version of Sojourner Truth's speech, of which the original was never fully and accurately transcribed, is a reimagining in a southern dialect, not Truth's dialect, as she was a native Dutch speaker who prided herself on her Euro-American English, which was drafted by Frances Dana Barker Gage about a decade later during the Civil War, which is the time when Sojourner Truth's reputation began to grow exponentially. Not even the title of the speech was spoken by Truth, as it's easier to find out now than it might have been able to sort of know with certainty in 1992, when there were a lot of disparate texts not connected with sort of a single overarching meta-narrative. But Tenney recognized in the opening to his program note that black women have always been doubly disenfranchised in our society, and Sojourner Truth was one of the earliest and most eloquent voices speaking out against both racist and sexist forms of oppression. Thus, he was observing a component of intersectional feminism before that term was widely known. I think it had actually been invented in 1991. Tenney's estate advised that this work, should be performed for your community in a way that's most respectful of the needs of this community, as long as the integrity of the work is also respected, because I believe at one point there had been some idea that maybe the work could be adapted for a more contemporary political atmosphere, namely the sense of black voice in a composition by a white artist. But the feeling in the artistic and musical community who were consulted was that the piece should not be programmed. In David's words, I was hearing that the entire premise of white art based on black pain is, at the very least, not something the black community would be interested in seeing. So, does anyone have any views on this piece as I've described it to you, or whether you've read about it or heard it even, and the idea of it being programmed or not programmed in any fashion?
Yeah, it's just tough because I feel like this is a problem that just the world in general has, where it's just like, it's sensitive times. It was back then, it is now, I think always is when you start talking about race and things like that. But yeah, it's like, I just feel like it's about the message. I don't know if it makes sense, like, or trying to at least get more ears to hear things.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, myself, I'm just speaking for me, like, I hate when it does get stuck at sometimes. And it's just for myself, at race sometimes. Like, it doesn't want to go further as, like, look, it's a discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So that's somebody's, and it's about art too, and it's just the way I feel. Like, when I make art, I'm not thinking about color or this or that. I just make it, you know, that's my activism. Just make it and go where people wouldn't think I was supposed to go. You know, that's me sending my message and wanting other people to see that, you know? So a white person came up with something to think. I'm like, it's good. I would say probably better to converse with people. Like, if you're gonna come up with a piece, maybe get more information from someone in the community, so it's just not like a blank throw. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Right.
Right? So that's one way, right? Just to have conversation, and so what? Someone white does it, okay, cool. They're letting other white people that maybe don't have access to certain things hear a bit about it, so they can do their research, and then it can kind of trickle and grow and expand that way. So yeah, I don't know, I just, like, myself, I just try to, like, see if I can, like, see something else out of that. Like, he's an artist, you know, he's a composer, and as artists, it's hard to be, like, art is free and you can come up with stuff, but in the same time, it's like you can't,
Yeah.
you know? So it's this weird thing that happens there.
Yeah.
I'm like, is it art? Are we supposed to, like, you know, bits of inspiration from here and there? Or if we believe strongly in something, like, we gotta, like, say it. So if you want to support, that's how you do it. And it just sucks when you try to do that and then it gets, like, I don't know, like, right away, doesn't have a chance to
Reaction.
even, you know. And then maybe if it's like, maybe, you know, the community should come out more to, like, those, like, that's the way you know. So it's like,
I think the idea
rather
is we
than-
wanted the community to
Yeah.
come out.
Mm-hmm.
but they decided not to. Is that what?
Well, I mean, I think we're characterizing this as a community decision because a number of
Right.
people were consulted. Some would be vocal and upfront about, or some would be anonymous and some would not be.
Mhm.
I have to admit that I had reservations about it being performed, but my response was, what can we do to program it differently?
Mhm.
And even that met with resistance. So I guess a sort of a subset of this question, and Parmela, I would like to let you speak as well, and Lauren, do you respect that decision made by the community or the collective not to have it programmed? Yeah, sure, go ahead if you want to finish, Chel, or...
No, of course. I mean, you gotta respect it. They talked, but it's just like, for me, again, it's like, you respect people's decisions and stuff, but I would like to see more, I don't know, attempts at getting over the hump a little bit, you know, because I feel like, and in not just this situation, there's like tons more things where it just doesn't
Yeah.
want to just go over.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're having this discussion as a direct result
Yeah.
of that decision. So for the context for the audience, I think one of the seeds, to reference the Jim Tenney title, for this discussion was the fallout from that piece attempting to be programmed and not making it on the bill.
And what was that fallout?
I think just the decision not to have it programmed. So the responses that David heard, whether it was through email threads or I don't know how else he heard from, but he consulted artists, the Artistic Advisory Council, and the music gallery, as I think everyone is aware, has changed over its 40 plus years. Where in recent seasons it's become much more egalitarian, socially minded, inclusive. And so I think these issues are definitely more critical.
Well, I have I've got two things to say. First of all, I absolutely respect the decision of the community whether they choose to program it or not to program it. It's all about community. It's all about where you live and where you make music and where you make your music to be heard. And so I wonder a little bit about and I know in this case, David really worked hard to get a lot of different opinions. But if just one person had insisted that this not happen, would that be enough? I mean, how many no votes do you have to get?
Right.
And I know Anne was telling me that certain people, any situation in which a white man essentially takes over and uses the voice of a black woman is potentially a triggering situation, and that's got to be honored. Does that mean that this piece should never be performed because it has the possibility of triggering some person? I can't answer that question. The second thing I would like to bring up is that another piece that you'll be hearing tonight is Picadon. And there are two parts to that. The first half is texts written by the scientists who worked on the atomic bomb testing projects in Alamogordo. They're speaking, and the second half is texts by women and children who survived the bombings in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. They're speaking, and in both cases, the white men's voices are spoken by white men, some of them sitting in this very room, and the women and children in Japan those texts were spoken by white women. Again, a number of them sitting in this room tonight.
Including yourself.
Including myself, and including Wend, and including Gail, Reiner, I don't know, who the guy said.
Sorry.
So the question, when I heard about the decision about Ain't I a Woman, I immediately thought, well, should we really be playing Picadon? Should we? Because at some point, if it shouldn't be enough that people are, only if people complain do we do the right thing. That's what it kind of felt like to me.
Okay.
Because the voices of these women's texts were again about the pain of Asian people, and in a sense, Jim could be viewed as taking the pain and making it into his art.
Yes.
So I don't have an answer to this, but clearly nobody did complain about Picadon, and we're presenting it anyways. But if it's wrong in one circumstance, why is it not wrong in the second circumstance? That's my question there.
Do one of you want to answer that or attempt to answer it? How is it different?
I don't know that there is actually an answer. I just
Reflect.
I think perhaps there's more sensitivity about one ethnocultural group, or in this case, the black female, and perhaps people are less aware of, or less less conscious of being sensitive to the Asian female. I don't know. But I couldn't help thinking. I mean, I'm sorry that the piece wasn't programmed. And I'm really glad that we're having this conversation. I almost wish that we had the conversation and then we're able to hear the piece. And I actually wish that we could do that with more pieces that are because there are a myriad of let's call them Western classical pieces that are controversial, and we haven't thought about it. I mean, the most recent one that most of us are probably aware of in this room was Lou Riel.
Yes, great example.
And was anybody consulted when they made that decision? I think
you're talking about the recent staging.
The recent staging of Louis Riel as for the sesquicentennial, which became controversial. I think it was programmed quite a while ago, before Truth and Reconciliation, but because it was performed after the TRC, suddenly it became this problematic work that there were panels and discussions and conferences, and I attended a lot of them, and it opened up an interesting debate, both good, positive, and I'm not going to say negative, I'm going to say problematic.
Okay.
And I think that the problematic side of all sorts of Western art, we need to now start to unpack that. And Madame Butterfly, even Mozart, Opera Seraglio, all sorts of things. Anytime, for me, in fact, Esprit Orchestra tonight, we're playing Taboo Gun,
Right.
McPhee. I mean, good grief, I hear it and I just think, that's just Gamelon, and you just orchestrated Gamelon, like, who owns that?
Yeah.
The whole notion of ownership, and so that's also the colonial, it's part of the colonialism of the Eurocentric male, shall we say. But I think we're in an interesting moment to start unpacking all of these things, and it just so happens we've done it with Lou Riel over the last few months, and now with Jim's work. I'm really sorry that we're not hearing it, actually.
My own response to the general area of appropriation, I'm not going to go as far as to say Jim was appropriating anything. The speech is part of collective history now. But the idea of white art on black pain. My own response is that the difference might be where you are in a situation where someone's getting a gig and someone else who might get that gig is not getting that. And I should point out also that there was thought given to, well, who should perform the work? Who should be doing the oral utterances? There's actually I don't believe there are any full words or sentences, and it's all just phonemes.
No.
No, is that not true?
No, the lead cellist speaks the full text.
Oh, okay.
And without any, it's solo, right? She's just speaking. There's no music.
She's speaking and playing the translation that he made
At the
to
same
cello
time.
At the same time.
Yeah.
So and then the chamber orchestra is enhancing that level.
This is Anne Bourne, who was in the premiere, I believe, in Amsterdam. Is that?
Montreal.
Actually, it was
Montreal.
in
Montreal,
It
okay.
was programmed at a cello symposium
Okay.
in Montreal.
So are there different versions of the work where because this program note does not mention?
No, it was commissioned by Patrick Darby in Montreal for a cello symposium.
Okay.
I don't believe it's ever been performed.
He asked him to write a piece for the cellist Frances Mary Wheaty.
Yeah.
And he wrote this.
Who speaks Dutch?
Well, she's American, but expat in Amsterdam. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I guess that's sort of even further from my query. Could a situation like this be rectified if if it were allowing black artists to have their voice, black women specifically, to have a voice in the production of this piece, or would it be an exponential problematic situation where we're just contracting a black person to perform this black piece and to create minstrelsy unintentionally?
So,
Yes.
I just learned tonight that it's not even, it was an adaptation of her speech. It wasn't actually even her speech, and it was in Southern dialect.
That's right.
Who did that?
So Frances Dana Barker Gage, who was an abolitionist, so who would have been a colleague of Truth's. So the original speech in 1851 was never properly recorded. I think there was an account in a newspaper at the time, an abolitionist newspaper, but it wasn't an accurate transcription. It was more of an account, and there was a little bit of dramatization of how the audience responded. And then once Gage did her version, she just sort of went full with the dramatization about how the audience was just floored and their kind of emotional responses to it, and she added that dialect, the black Southern dialect. So we don't know. There is no definitive, undisputed truth.
I actually don't think the version that Jim used in the piece is the black dialect version. I don't remember.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it is.
He mentions it, references the text that he got it from, and I hadn't had time to find it, so I'm not sure. And not having been able to see the score, I don't know.
Yeah.
Any further thoughts there?
Well, it's an anachronism because it says like lifted over ditches into carriages, so it's a historical aberration, even if you said it in.
One way or the other.
Yeah.
What's
Yes.
that now? What's a historical aberration?
It refers to being lifted over ditches into carriages, so it puts you in that time period.
Well, it's antebellum, yeah.
Yeah, it's so tricky. It's like like if you're like there's influence by something and like sort of I guess taking a story and then you're kind of inspired by it, you still want to send the same message out, and then there's a difference if it like you could have that. I'm gonna use movies as an example.
Mm-hmm.
Like you could have someone fit that role, like a black person fit a role, but instead they'll like have someone in like blackface.
Right.
Or like it's written for someone who's Asian, but like we see it a lot. There's that, which
Puccini and
is
Verdi as well, and black
Yeah.
opera. Yeah.
there's that, which to me is even it's more like it's like in your face. It's like but with the music and like just hearing more about this piece that is it might be this or it might be that. There's a little bit of this or it's not like the exact text and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's
Thank you.
sorry. Yeah, I don't know. It's just tricky. It's just a tricky. It's like what's acceptable, what's not, what's art, what's not. There's so much like walking on eggshells around the whole thing, no matter how you. I don't know.
Well, Jim certainly, for context again, was not alone in this sort of approach. The precedent's going back to Reich in the 60s with Come Out and It's Gonna Rain, where he was literally taking wholesale text spoken by a black person in the U.S. And using that cadence and meaning to create the body of the piece. A far more extreme approach than Jim was using, which was getting analytical, as he liked to do, with the sound, with the sound spectrum. So I think we could come back to that maybe if there's time for an audience comment, but I'd like to explore some other aspects here. Lauren, I guess I wanted to. There was a YouTube video. There is a YouTube video that you should see if you have time. It was made a few years ago in your home, and it is. I can link anybody who wants it. It's a documentary about the archives that you have in your home. There are some archives elsewhere.
Well, the main archive is at York University,
Okay.
and we are in the process of getting everything moved up to York University.
Right.
Still.
But you were just sort of you'd find a piece, an artifact, a personal item. It's a charming video. And you would just tell a little tiny story and then move on. And then there'd be a shot of like your garden with the with all of the cacti and things. But you just you referenced something that I remember from him as a teacher, something about his approach, which I take now as it was something that was different. It was a form of resistance, or a way of resisting that I encountered at the time. I think it could be more standard in teaching now, and it should be. And you said he assigned chronicles to his students in order for them to understand the context of musical events. Not just the musical events happening in a vacuum, but what was going on in the culture at the same time. So with that quote in mind, how do you think Jim would respond to the world we're in 2017? This is now 11 years after his passing.
Well, I think he would be just as angry and appalled and hopeless as we all are in the United States at this moment. Well, not all of us, but many, the right-thinking people anyways. I mean, it's an impossible situation south of the border there. I think he would be just humiliated, embarrassed, angry. He was very passionate about what anti-war work he did, and this whole new situation. I don't know. I mean, my response to it for a few months was I got heavily into political action, and then I got fairly sick at the end of April, and I think a lot of that was due to the stress of that. So I backed off, but I believe that that's the only thing that I can do.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only response, and I would like to believe that Jim would be there with me, registering voters, going out into the community. Again, it's all about going out into the community, getting those people to register to vote, and then get out on election day. That's the only way we're going to change anything down there. And I think he would have helped me.
I believe that. When I had a chance to interview him in the year 2000, we were just having a conversation and starting to go just sort of spontaneously to various topics, and he was very passionate about the relationship of as many of you will know, the relationship of art and capitalism. And the way that you could put it succinctly was during one of the many happy hours that we enjoyed, where he said music and money should just have nothing to do with one another. And when it came to arts funding in Ontario specifically, he was very vocal in this interview. And he characterized the politicians of the time. I'm not going to try to remember who they are now, but he said he called them the fools from the sticks, little Ronald Reagan wannabes. So I think there's some value in looking at him as someone who was socially conscious, not just about issues that affected a specific marginalized section of society, but also about the approach of the overall society to the arts. And that was an aspect of resistance, because resistance can have many forms. And on that note, I would like to ask, what are these other forms of resistance we can think of besides just talking about socially conscious? I know we're supposed to be saying socially conscious, but let's just put that aside for a second and go back up to a festival that's based on resistance, the theme of resistance. What does that mean to you? What does resistance mean to you? In 2017. Specific.
I think to me it means a failure, not a failure, but a conscious decision to not accept what we've been given.
Mm-hmm.
And you hear that all the time in the States. They say, well, the election's over, we won, you didn't, live with it. And you have to say, no, we are not living with it. We're going to fight every stupid decision that gets made. We're going to call people. We're going to make people stand up for their votes and say, I voted to repeal Obamacare 15 times, and I'm going to do it again. And instead of letting them hide in the background and, you know, get away with it, I think that's the kind of resistance that has to happen every day, really.
Parmela?
I was just thinking of resistance in terms of changing history, or changing not history, but changing the way. So I think for us in Canada, it's more about what I would be resisting is fighting against the continuing, like, a persistence of doing things the same way.
Yeah.
So it's very much an anti-colonial kind of thing. The fighting of, I mean, obviously we're looking at what's happening in the States, and that's, in the orchestras, I have to tell you, every break, that's always the topic of conversation. And it's actually interesting for me because I always look at things from a very Canadian perspective, whereas my colleagues are really, in terms of, I'm looking at the orchestra and looking at that as a site of, well, I'm conflicted. I'm very conflicted as somebody trained in Western classical music who is now perceived by anyone who doesn't know me. Like, if someone sees me on the street, doesn't know that I'm a Western classical musician, they might wonder, what the heck am I doing playing that music?
Right.
I mean, I get that all the time from my father's friends. I always have since the moment I decided to go into music. So, for me, resistance is really about changing systems. But it's a big, kind of tortoise-like system that we have. But it's kind of interesting, the American and the Canadian situation. So as I said, you know, sitting in orchestra, everyone's talking about the politics of the United States. I'm looking at the politics of the Canadian orchestra going, okay. I see something else. I see something else happening here.
Do arts organizations, sorry, Cheldon, do you want to add something there? Go ahead.
To add to it, yeah, the same thing. It's just like just fighting against things that you don't see as right, you know, like, and for me, like you said, it's like we're focused on America, resisting that. One of the things I really like is on my mind a lot these days is like what's happening to the earth, to be like, and I think there needs to be more resistance also in that place too, because that's where we all are. You know, so I can't help it, but like these days, every time I'm getting on all these conversations of the war over here and this happening over there, and like, you know, race fights and this and that, and I'm like, there's something like even bigger. So I know it's like throwing things like totally off the.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so, because.
But it's just like,
And actually, you know, I mean, among many other responses one could have to that, it makes me go back to Jim's work, because he was all about perception and all about creating revelatory experiences. He was not about creating an emotional message, and so one might think, well, it's not going to be political because he doesn't want people to have a message or an emotional response, but he wants you to have a response which is opening your senses to what is around you as clearly as possible. And back to that theme of the composer is not privy to anything. You know, he wants to create a process for you to be in touch with that some kind of shared reality. I just want to touch briefly on arts organizations outside of the music gallery. Do we think that arts organizations should have a socially conscious agenda? And I want to bring up an example, just a personal example, small example as a starter. I noticed that Massey Hall, Roy Thompson Hall, is booking Valery Gergiev and the Mariinsky Orchestra, and he's been known to be vocally vocally homophobic, and that there's some dispute as to how homophobic he is. I mean, but he's certainly, there's been examples, and I tweeted at the Toronto Symphony Orchestra's account that it was hypocritical of them on during Pride 2017 to be, oh, hey, here's our rainbow flag, at the same time as they were premiering this friend of Putin and supposedly a friend of the homophobic movement in Russia. And their response, the Toronto Symphony's account, was, we just rented the space. Talk to the corporation. It's not the Toronto Symphony. So, I had it wrong. I was thinking the Toronto Symphony had it was part of their program. It's not. So, and that was the end of the discussion. Not our problem. So do you think that there's an issue there that needs to be discussed further? Or rather, not that specific issue, but do arts organizations need to think more about this now?
I think they're being forced to.
Mm-hmm.
Canada, we all know the Canada Council is forcing us to look at these issues.
Mm-hmm.
And some are doing it without being forced to. David Pay out in, he's running ISCM this year. He has pledged to have 50% of all composers be women, which is unheard of in ISCM. I mean, in previous years, you'd be lucky to have 10% women composers. So
yeah.
I'm sure it was an incredible process to find that many women composers and get them played, but I mean, he made that decision and he's sticking with it. And arts organizations, I think the Music Gallery here is a good example of how it's changed over the years, since it's very, very different in its commitment to social justice issues and diversity of all kinds, than very much so, very different than it was 15 years ago. But again, it's a process. It has to change over time, and things like this are what happen to help it change. People talking about what the issues are, instead of saying, we're just going to keep going the way we always did. We've got all these great guy composers, so let's put them on stage, and it's too bad if we can't find women composers. That's just the way it is. I mean, it's got to change, and somebody's got to change it. People have got to step up and change it, and Music Gallery is, David Pay is. I think only through time and more people becoming brave enough to do that, and with a little help from Canada Council maybe.
There's also a new scholarship in some of the New York area. I think it's called the Hildegard Scholarship. So it's another example of a scholarship for young women composers, emerging composers, specifically targeted there, which I think is a great idea.
You just made me think of, I wasn't actually thinking of female composers, like female-male division.
Yeah,
but,
binary.
But that did remind me of a different kind of resistance, a conversation I had with a colleague this morning about someone who said to me not long ago that, well, yeah, Spree didn't program any female composers this year, again. And my colleague actually corrected me and said, no, there is one. No, it's not Alexina. But that's the alternate side of resistance. An institution that's resisting a greater will to see institutions change. And so even within that culture, here's my colleague who is male. He's thinking, oh, that's ridiculous that you're not going to support the orchestra because there aren't female composers. And I have to say, I for one boycotted the New Creations Festival a couple of years ago when there was not one female represented as composer or soloist. So, so there are two sides of resistance.
When you've got gravity on your side, it doesn't take a lot of work to hold somebody down. I don't mean that to be too flippant, but
That's a good one.
we're at 7:30. I think we just have a few minutes, but David, do you think we have time for a little bit of audience feedback or comment?
We should take a question or two.
Sure. Okay. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask or a comment they'd like to make? Hi.
Hi. Thanks, everyone. I'm curious just to hear a little bit from you folks about like practices of learning to listen and how those kinds of things come into this. Like you mentioned a piece not being the easiest thing to listen to, and that seems like it's a line that any kind of experimental or avant-garde art always has to navigate, is that you sort of have to be in the practice of teaching to listen, or you have to find an audience that's willing to be
address that, or? I think it does address an issue that Tenny's work could potentially help you answer, because many of his works, I mean, I think his approach in general was to set up an experience that was unique. He was never about genre. Every single work is a different experience and a different process that he wanted to explore, an auditory process, perceptual process, or social process. The postcard pieces about, and one of the pieces which is tonight, which is sort of a postcard style, where you're going to see performers coming together as a community to solve a problem, to create a work that is, they're not being told exactly what to do, which is the situation we're in right now. We don't know exactly what to do, so we have to come together and solve it. Gail.
To respond to that question, and connect it with what you said about the importance of perception in Jim's work, there's an element that hasn't been discussed tonight yet, and that's the element of empathy, which to me is connected to learn to listen. And my experiences of these pieces by Jim is that their intent and their practical effect is to assist the audience in empathizing with the victims.
I think that's true.
Are you thinking specifically of Picadon in that sense?
Also of the anti-woman.
Anti-woman.
Yeah. Also with Viet Flakes.
Mm.
You had a.
It was kind of in line with what Gail was saying.
Okay.
The notion of eliminating the deeply embedded in our language, in Western European language in particular, is the fact that everything is nounified. We objectify and nounify everything, and we're talking about process and perception. That's a verb. That's relational, and that's listening, reacting, responding, interacting. I think that's where I think most of you are talking about that very thing. You know, I mean, to try and stop something ideologically without creating a dialogue is a mistake. I don't care where you're from. It's a mistake. It stops relationship, it stops empathy, and it stops learning.
But are you talking about stopping something from being played, or?
Well, that's just one example of things positioning themselves ideologically before the conversation can begin.
Well, we all know that John Cage was one of Tenny's mentors and a colleague, in a sense that the conversation was not one way. That Tenny also inspired Cage to re-examine harmony after he heard Jim's critical band, I think. And that one of Cage's famous comments is that there were some composers who were getting rid of glue, and I think, I'm not sure if that would have included the New York School. I'm not sure who he was speaking of, but I remember that expression, getting rid of glue, getting rid of your sort of your mental stuckness.
Well, even Sun Ra said, if the impossible has been tried, let's try the impossible.
Right.
Right? I mean, to go back to that process, for example. Let's go somewhere where we haven't been, collectively.
Yeah, I'm gonna throw in, going back to you're talking about like teaching people how to listen. Could you just, Yeah.
Learn to listen yourself.
Learn to listen. Yeah, it's definitely a process for sure. Because the thing is, like, I've made like a bunch of albums, and in my head I have this thing like I want to talk about the environment, I want to talk about race, whatever. But not everyone's gonna hear that. There's that tricky thing with what's in the composer's head versus what just the general audience is gonna take. Everyone's gonna take a little different piece of it. It definitely helps when there's some like dialogue, before you go in and listen to it, and then that could possibly help the process of like opening up and listening. But when it comes to like just abstract or experimental music, already just sometimes that word alone will just close the door. Yeah, on some people. So I think it's just the process that's going to take time. The more it happens, then it'll just start to, I don't know, just open up that platform for people to kind of like, I guess, discover more new things or open up. Just to, a quick example, like for myself, I've been working with sound streams, and for me, it's like for them too, it's something pretty new what they're doing, because normally they do like contemporary music, classical music, and here I am with like a turntable and doing like things like this and mixing like, I don't know, classical records in a different way. But it's gotta happen, like, you know, like someone's gotta do it, and that's how I feel. Like it's like, if I go in and do that, then I can create that conversation. You know, some people might be like, no way, like, what are you doing in our world or whatever? But I don't know.
Our world. Who's us?
But you know, it's like that's how change happens. Like you just gotta just try different things. Somebody's gotta be in there to do that, and then hopefully, for me, my hope is that other people like me see me in there, and then that starts to create something, you know, and keeps it rolling. And then, you know, as far as organizations go, I definitely, like, I don't want it to just be about the mandate, you know. I would like to see more of, like, not the mandate of having like people of color or whatever in there, and I think that'll also kind of change things too. Maybe it's just getting more voices in that are part of the community. We keep coming back around to the community, to be the voices in these places rather than I don't know, just guessing or something. Like have an actual person to be in there. So I feel like I'm trying to do that on my own, but yeah, that's it.
Thank you for relating that, telling us more about your work. Anne?
I spent the afternoon in Scarborough Centre Library with Christopher Willis. He's a resident artist there, and I worked with kids who they have no money. They're in public housing. Their mothers were all there. They're from Eritrea, from Congo, from South India, and I taught them polynomials, text scores, and listening. And they had violins and cellos, and brought a bunch of little Casio keyboards and delay units and amps and stuff, and just got everybody improvising a chamber piece together, 14 of them. And it was beautiful. They composed. I said, you're composers. So work with the children too.
I guess that almost opens up the question, not just what is a socially conscious composer, but what is a composer? Who is allowed to be a composer?
Right. Jim and Pauline would have had an opinion about that.
Yes. Everybody. Here comes everybody.
There you go. So, any more comments? One more, I think. Hi.
So, like, Tanya obviously had, like, a very, like, clear idea of kind of what makes Western music what it is, like, from a musical point of view, and, like, how a Western listener would listen to music. Do you think this is in any way connected to his, like, ability to, like, kind of empathize more with other cultures and understand what Western culture is in, like, non-musical context?
Lauren?
I'm not. Are you saying that he? I'm a little bit unclear of what the premises of the question.
I was saying that yeah, it's like a good idea of like how kind of Western music develops, and like how Western people kind of listen to music and like on a very like detailed technical kind of level. But then obviously there's all this stuff of like you also had great empathy for other cultures in like non-musical ways. So I just wondered if the two, if you think the two are like particularly connected, his ability to understand like Western music and like Western cultures, places in the world.
Well, I think there could be a range of reactions to one's. I mean, he was heavily immersed in traditional classical music for some years before he started veering off in the experimental direction. I think he, like many composers, like Colin McPhee, like Ligeti, who was obsessed with African music and African rhythms and studied them. Jim also studied for years the musics of many other cultures, and it didn't even enter into his own music somehow, which was very process based. But he learned so much from these other cultures about tuning, for one thing. That was absolutely central to his explorations and experimentations. So I think he believed that his culture, and he could learn from any culture as long as it helped him become more knowledgeable and more understanding about the power of human perception. And I think he would go anywhere and go to any culture to learn what he could from that culture, because each culture has its own way of developing perceptual skills that are needed, and I think he would have learned from any culture that could help him understand that.
I think he was also very, very appreciative, and vocally so, of his own elders, of his own artistic elders, because many of his pieces were titled, were dedicated in the titles to those who he had taught or been inspired by, within admittedly a white male constraint, but that was his community, and this is where he was coming from, and he was at least getting beyond this idea that you have this anxiety of influence, and you have to be, I'm like the iconoclast, and there's no one who's come before me. Well, I think that at least in that sense, his ego was a little more open. Yeah.
He commented in an article that was prepared for MusicWorks that the neurological and physical process of sound perception is shared among all humans, and that individual cultural colorings of it, as you said, contribute perhaps a little bit more attention to rhythm here, a little bit more attention to pitch there. But I think that at the time that he did this article, he was hoping that the music would be able to transcend cultural division and focus on our physical, psychoacoustic, neurological sound perception.
The commonality of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
David? Yeah. I think we have to wrap it up now. Thank you very much, Parmela. Thanks, Parmela. Go. Thank you, Chel. Thank you, Lauren. Thanks, everybody.